ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Nice to see such a big crowd here. It's just showing that matters to do with cyber are, I think, growing in the level of interest that the town has around these things. Now, we're here to launch the third edition of the Cyber Maturity in the Asia Pacific Region report, and we're very lucky to have Dan Tehan here, who's going to say a few words, and then Toby, who will give us the, I guess, the highlights of the document. Now, Dan Tehan, I think, would be known to many of you. He's the member for the seat of Wannon in the House of Representatives, Wannon country seat in Victoria, first elected in 2010, then subsequently in 13 and 16. He's got a very busy ministerial portfolio: Minister for Veterans Affairs, Minister assisting the Prime Minister for the centenary of Anzac, Minister for Defence Personnel, and Minister assisting the Prime Minister for cyber security. And you can ask Dan how he apportions his week with those different responsibilities. Before that, he was Minister for Defence Material up to the previous election, and before that, Chair of the Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee from December of 13 to March of this year. A very significant time in the history of that committee because of the volume of counter-terrorist legislation that was going through the House. Prior to his parliamentary career, Dan had been a Deputy State Director for the Liberal Party in Victoria, and among his qualifications before entering Federal Parliament: Masters of Foreign Affairs and Trade from Monash University, Masters of International Relations from the University of Kent. Probably makes you the most qualified person in terms of master's degrees on international relations, Dan. Prior to that, Farmhand, 1986, which is kind of like a master's degree for dealing with Parliament, I guess. And he was an officer in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and also a diplomat in Latin America. Yeah. He's also had experience as a trade advisor to the Minister for Trade and a senior advisor to the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister, so well experienced. Dan's taken to the cyber portfolio with great energy and purpose, which I think has been significantly appreciated in this town. It can't be an easy task, Dan, to advise the Prime Minister on cyber matters, given Mr Turnbull's level of interest and experience. So we all wish you the best of luck for that. And can I now invite you to launch the book? Thank you. Please welcome Dan.
Thanks, Peter, and can I acknowledge Gai Brotman, who's here with us today. I had the pleasure of travelling with Gai to South Korea. I think 2 weeks ago, Gai, we took 8 veterans with us to commemorate the 65th anniversary since the Korean War. 4 of those veterans had never been back in that 65-year period, and was a remarkable visit with 8 remarkable Australians. So it's good. The Magnificent Eight, we called them, and so it's great to see you here, Gai. The ambassador from Estonia is with us. It's great to see you again, Ambassador, and also the Swiss ambassador is with us. So if I could acknowledge both of you, and if I could just thank ASPI, Peter, for the wonderful work that you do. It is fantastic to have an organisation with the credibility that you have, which produces such high quality analysis on matters right across the broad spectrum of national security. It's just fantastic, and you can see through the audience here today the way that you are regarded, and it's an absolute credit to you. So and thanks very much for the invitation to be here. Can I acknowledge Ambassador Designate Toby, who is with us this evening, and who will speak after me. Myself and the Foreign Minister did a little video clip announcing Toby's appointment this afternoon, and to give you a sense of how qualified he is for the role. The Twitter sphere has taken off like there is no tomorrow in acknowledging this appointment. And once again, Toby, your background is going to be outstanding to have you come into this role, and it's a key part of our national cyber security strategy, the ambassadorial role, and the fact that you've been appointed. And I know there was a lot of detailed consideration given as to who had the right expertise to fill that role, and the fact that you've been appointed is an absolute credit to you, and can also say more broadly a credit to ASPI as well. So it's great to be here with you. Peter, you mentioned before the time that I had as a farmhand. I wasn't going to mention this story, but I will, because it sort of ties in a little bit to the role assisting the Prime Minister on cyber. When I joined DFAT, they, as part of their graduate program, they decided that the 30 graduates needed some leadership training. So they sent us to a farm, which was just on the other side of Lake George. And it was for 3 days, so we packed our bags, hopped on a bus and headed out to the farm near Lake George. We got off the bus and they said, well, we just want you to leave your bags on the bus, and we've just got a first sort of activity we'd like you to undertake. And so we all hopped off the bus and looked around, and the instructor said, there's 30 sheep down in that paddock down there, and the paddock wasn't too big. It was probably the size of the floor space here in this building. And we'd like you to bring them in and put them in this yard. Now, 29 very keen DFAT graduates, very keen to please, all sort of took off down this paddock trying to bring a sheep in at a time, each one sort of identifying the sheep that they were going to get in this yard. And so sheep running everywhere, graduates running everywhere. And I sort of said, look, I don't think this is really going to be all this successful. I said, what about if we just all line up and we just bring them up this fence line and then bring them into the yard? And so that's what we did. We formed the line because we didn't have a sheepdog, and just brought them in and put them in the yard. And we did it in 5 minutes. And the instructor said to me, it's not meant to work like that. This is meant to take about half an hour, and you're all meant to get exhausted, and then we bring you in and we say, we're going to teach you about, before you undertake any task, you should sit down, plan, coordinate and work out what's the best way to do it. And I said, well, that's very interesting. I think we should also discuss, though, why, when you've been running this for 5 years, that you haven't had someone who's come from a farm to undertake this activity, especially when the 30 of us are going to be going out and representing our country overseas. But the point I would make is this new role is a bit like herding sheep, and because we do have different bureaucratic structures for dealing with cyber, and this is one of the important things about Toby's appointment, is that once again, when it comes to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, he's going to have a key role in making sure we're coordinating across government, because it is an area which is very important to defence. It's an area which is very important when it comes to AGs. It's an important area when it comes to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And making sure those agencies and others are working together, coordinating together, are planning together, is absolutely vital in this area, because if we don't get that right, we will be like those 29 graduates and just everyone heading in their own direction, and we won't make the type of decisions that we need to make sure that we are keeping ourselves cyber secure. One of the really good things about this report that we are launching today is that it clearly shows that because of the cyber strategy, we're heading in the right direction. We've moved from 5th to 4th. Now, Obviously, our ultimate game is to get to number one, but just by the fact that we've put a strategy in place is so important. We've put resources to that strategy, $230 million to back it up, plus $400 million went into the Defence White Paper in the cyber area. So we've got real resources, financial resources when it comes to not only having a strategy but implementing it, and that is absolutely vital. There are some areas where we've still got work to do. One of the keys is to make sure that we've got the human resources that we need. There was a report which was released during the week which shows quite clearly that when it comes to young Australians thinking about a career in cyber, that it's not clear enough on their radar as an occupation that they should pursue and should look to fulfil as a career. And one of the really, I wouldn't say alarming, but one of the things that really needed to be highlighted from this report also was that there was, especially when it came to young females, there was a real lack of awareness as to the opportunities that could be presented when it comes to cyber, and this is something that we're going to have to work on. The other thing that it clearly showed was there's a real need for us to have mentors in this space. And, you know, I think Toby's appointment is going to be fantastic in that you, Toby, are going to become a mentor in this area, in the same way that Alistair McGibbon is in assisting the Prime Minister. You will become a mentor in the role that you're about to pursue. And that is absolutely vital as well, because with good mentors, we're going to encourage good people also to go into this area. And if we are going to deal with this issue going forward, it's something that we are going to have to continue to encourage people. The other area that it pointed to was the fact that we need more people doing STEM, but also when it comes to STEM, we need to understand who in Australia now is undertaking STEM subjects, and 70% of those people come from a non-English speaking background. So one of the key things we've got to also do is make sure that their parents, because when it comes to those cultural groups, their parents have a large say in the types of careers they will undertake. We've got to make sure that their parents will encourage them to go into this area. So that's an area from a government perspective that we're going to have to keep working on. Another area where I think we've still got to do some work, but once again this week we've seen a very good announcement which was part of the strategy which will help in that area. That's in the area of making sure when it comes to critical infrastructure that we've got the right security in place. It's a difficult one in our federal structure because that critical infrastructure, sometimes it's in private sector hands, sometimes it's in government hands, sometimes there's federal responsibility for that critical infrastructure, sometimes it's state government responsibility, sometimes it can be some public ownership and some private ownership. So there's a lot of work to be done in that area. But we announced this week that the ASX are about to embark on their top 100 cyber security checks. So there is going to be auditing of our top 100 companies by the ASX as to how cyber prepared they are. And that will be a big advancement in making sure that that critical infrastructure is getting examined and audited in the right way. There is other work which we're undertaking as part of the strategy that we've made progress on this week. The National Cyber Security Centre, a decision has been taken that it will move. That move is about to be examined by the Public Audit Committee. So we've announced that this week. So I know that'll sound a bit bureaucratic to you all, but in terms of government getting action and doing, that's a very important step in making sure that we move that centre, and hopefully we will have it moved in the coming months. So there is work being done to make sure that we're not resting on our laurels from our 4th placement in this report. My hope is that given everything we're starting to do, that we will see us gradually move even further up. But I will leave it there. I think we're going to do a bit of Q&A after we've heard from the Ambassador Designate. But can I once again just thank ASPI for the very important work that they do, and can I just highly recommend this report for the transparency that it highlights in how each country is going, where countries are doing well, where they're not, and what is left to be done, in particular when it comes to Australia. So thanks very much for having me here today.
Thanks, Minister. There's a slight irony there. I didn't actually ever expect that I would end up becoming part of the scoring system for a methodology that we invented like 3.5 years ago now. So it seems a slight irony in standing up realising that I'll be part of the scoring for next year. Hopefully I can add to the positive scoring rather than negative. You can hold me to that. So some of you here might have noticed that a new Ambassador for Cyber Affairs was mentioned today, and amongst some other minor news stories that you might have seen in the papers. Hopefully I'm a slightly less controversial appointment than others that we could comment on. I mean, needless to say, I mean, this is a huge honour for me, and I'm extremely excited. I'm looking forward to taking up this position and taking up the challenge I think that it presents. I'm going to deliver it with all the enthusiasm, the hard work and purpose that I bring to any job, but I feel that extra sense of importance of carrying, you know, Australia's national interests on my shoulders as well, and rest assured I will do my best in every way I can. And I'm very excited about working with Minister Tehan, with the Prime Minister, with the Foreign Minister, with the Special Advisor for Cybersecurity and the rest of Australia's cybersecurity community, both in government and also in the private sector, NGO and beyond. I think you'll have all noticed that the position is called the Ambassador for Cyber Affairs, and that's because the engagement on international cyber issues has to reach beyond just cybersecurity issues. I think it's a wider portfolio than the cybersecurity portfolio. It needs to encompass, of course, issues of conflict prevention and cybersecurity discussions, but I think it's imperative that the work that's conducted works strongly to advance Australia's overseas IT innovation and trade agenda, and looks to progress the economic advantage that Australia can gain in this area too. And I will take that responsibility very seriously indeed. And to help fulfil these goals, I'm intending to work incredibly actively to leverage the talent and expertise that already lies within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. You know, it's no secret Henry Fox has been doing incredible work already over a number of years, and I fully intend to work with the team there to progress even further the good work that's already been ongoing. But more broadly than that, as the Minister said, across government to engage with all those departments who have a role to play in our international engagement picture. And it's all about bringing in broader perspectives, broadening the tent so we can best position Australia in the future that is forthcoming. I also see it's incredible privilege to continue and change the focus of the work that we've been doing here in the International Cyber Policy Centre. As I said, I don't think I ever expected that the work we started 4 years ago would really lead to this. But it goes to show that the work was important, and the investment especially that Peter Jennings made in that initial gamble, if you like, on starting all of this up, really, I hope, you know, and I know now has paid off. I think it's testament to the work that ASPI does, the national leadership, you know, that Peter Jennings plays in many different areas, and he's not one afraid to take a gamble and a risk on important policy issues. So I'd like to add my thanks, because Peter plays an incredibly important role in that regard too. So when we originally created the International Cyber Policy Centre, and many of you will remember me darkening your doors with this initial concept paper of what we can do, we felt that core, at its heart, had to be this awareness raising and progression of the national level debate on cybersecurity issues, but also that regional discussion, and raise the level of awareness, raise the level of transparency on what was going on around the region. And the bedrock, I think, of the discussion has become this piece of work now that we're now in our third iteration of. Those that are deeply responsible for the hard work and research that goes into it might feel that it's more than 3 editions we've had because they spend so much time burrowing away, finding the information that is needed. But it's really provided a great discussion point, a kicking off point for both discussions here in Australia and also in the region. My opinion might change once I've been in government for some time, but I remember the initial discussions and the problems that we had over attributing numbers to each score, and how nervous many of our expert panels were of actually having numbers because it would cause diplomatic disquiet around the region. But in many respects, what I've seen is actually many countries enjoy the numbers, even if they look bad. I've had a lot of countries say to me, well, actually, that's been really useful for us because we've taken that into government and we've used it as a great case maker to get increased investment, increased importance placed on this issue of cybersecurity. So in the end, I think I'd stand by the numbers. They're a great leverage. Again, ask me that question in a year's time and I'll probably say, oh, I hate the numbers. Let's get rid of those. So what do we look at? Many of you here, I'm seeing many familiar faces you'll have seen and kind of grown aware of the methodology and what we look at, but what are we looking at its core? We're looking at the development of cyber policy and legislation. We're looking at responses to financial cybercrime, how militaries are adopting cyber capabilities into their broader frameworks, how a country is harnessing the digital economy, and also looking at what level of social engagement is going on within a particular country. The rationale behind what I must say again is a massive undertaking for a think tank of our size, and especially for the small team that I run here, is that we have to understand where we are as a region and where Australia is placed within that before we can work out where we need to drive, where we can actually improve, where we can work together with partners to improve our respective capabilities across the region. And hopefully others have found it useful, and I know from a lot of engagement from both governments and also the private sector, it's being used actively in this way. I'll pause for breath here just to reiterate and thank the incredible hard work that goes in to this report from my team. So Jessica Whittle, who's not actually part of my team now, she's flown off to bigger and better things, but Liam Neville also and Zoe Hawkins for the incredible amount of research. And it's probably not quite so obvious for this product that you see, but there are hundreds and hundreds of pages of research work that go into this. It's a Herculean effort, and by the end of it, they're all glad to see the back of it and see it actually in its published form. So what do we see? We continue to see the Asia Pacific as a driver of economic growth. It's the engine room. It's the global engine room of economic growth, regardless of slowdowns in growth rates. We're still seeing that this region is the place to be. Everyone wants to have a piece of the Asia Pacific story, and that we've seen has not dissipated in the last year. But we're also seeing, and increasingly in the media and in commentary, that there is an increasing arc of instability in the region, and tensions are playing out, whether they be territorial disputes or in the cybersphere. These are happening, and we see them, what's going on in cyberspace mimicking what we're seeing going on in the physical world. And they have the potential, cyber instances have the potential to destabilize those patterns of global trade that we want to protect so readily, and have the potential to spiral if they're not managed properly and they're not given due care and attention. What we've pointed out in the report at the outset are 2 particular trends that we felt were most concerning over the past year. And these have a regional consequence, and we do see them playing in the region. And the first of those is looking at critical national infrastructure targeting, and it's heartening to hear the work that's going on in Australia on this front now and looking at our cyber risks that we're carrying. But I think it's the Ukraine incident before Christmas last year that really set our radars buzzing on this front. We've seen that's the first time we've seen a cyber attack directly attributed to the physical takedown of electrical infrastructure. So why is that important to the region? Well, it's important because we're seeing critical infrastructure development go on at a rate of knots, be it in terms of the lower end of electrical grid supply, basic power supply, all the way up to the other more sophisticated end of critical infrastructure development for Internet of Things, smart cities, and some of the most sophisticated infrastructure developments we see anywhere on the planet are happening here. So that in itself means that we have great potential instability and disparity in terms of what's going on. And especially in terms of looking at the developments in ASEAN power grid development and telecommunications, we see some of the least developed countries in terms of their critical infrastructure development being connected to some of the most developed. And that means that cybersecurity has to be an imperative and perhaps needs to be given, or certainly needs to be given more attention at the building phase and design phase rather than as something that's bolted on after the thought. And this is an issue that applies to the organic spread of Internet of Things. And I think you're seeing an acceleration of the online space without a good understanding of what technical and policy approaches are needed to ensure that the development remains a net positive rather than becomes a vulnerability for society to try and absorb. So the risk of not considering security by design when it comes to the Internet of Things, I think we've already seen demonstrated in recent weeks by the DDoS attack, exposing many to the largest internet outage we've seen in history. And it might have gone actually unnoticed by some parts of society, but I don't think it's imperative not to allow that to go unnoticed and understand what that might mean for future developments that we're beginning to make in terms of infrastructure development. The other area, and it actually pertains to the other big news story of the day, is what we're seeing in terms of the use of information as a weapon, or the weaponization of data. And certainly we've seen that now throughout the US election cycle. And I think that does give us great pause for thought and reflection as to what that means for international norms, what that means for how vulnerable information can be in certain government systems. Historically, in the past, we've seen, of course, that governments want access to data, but often it was taken and left for national interest. Gather data, keep it in secret databases so that you could use that for your own advantage. It seems that now it's the use of data to openly humiliate and not actually cover your tracks quite so discreetly as you may have done in the past that seems to be becoming the new norm. And I think that does create a great concern, especially when you look at the rapid uptake of e-voting systems being introduced around the system. And that includes in places like Indonesia and potentially our own country as well. It's important that we consider how our conceptualization of critical infrastructure develops over the coming years, especially I think around the Internet of Things and what that actually means for what our infrastructure actually is. But let's return to some of the positives. What about our economic growth picture? Whilst there is still considerable economic growth, about 5.3% GDP growth across the region this financial year, it's not been evenly distributed. That trend still continues. We have countries such as Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. They remain still in that development stage and often removed from cyberspace's potential benefits for better governance, education, and business. Low levels of literacy, cost issues, access, and unreliable power among some of the many inhibitors and obstacles to greater connectivity that still remain in the region. But still, that mobile connectivity rate keeps growing exponentially. And even in countries now with low levels of fixed broadband connectivity, you can see mobile access is increasingly common. A country like Cambodia, only 0.5% actually have a fixed line broadband connection, but 42% of people have access to mobile internet connections. So it means that we will see, I think, these rapid jumps in the need for traditional forms of critical infrastructure in the future. The region's geographic size is matched by its enormous population, about 4 billion at last estimate. And despite the barriers to connectivity in the Asia-Pacific and still the potential for huge growth in connectivity, we still house the majority of the world's internet users. So, you know, there are good stories to be told there, and there's advantages to be made. Look at Indonesia, for example. Its internet economy currently accounts for only 1% of its GDP. But Indonesia, by 2018, is expected to become the biggest e-commerce market in Southeast Asia. The telecommunications market there is liberalised. It includes 8 mobile companies and 35 infrastructure-owning ISPs. 4G connectivity is across the country, accessible across the country. So you can see where this growth pattern is developing. But again, without a degree of security understanding, that competitive advantage could easily be lost. You see in India, it is the world's second largest user base of Android apps, and within a few years will have the highest number of apps developers in the world. The digital economy is transforming, I think, the way the region does business, but there are risks, and overzealous regulation is something that I think we're beginning to see increasingly around the region, and it's not helpful in terms of allowing economies to transform themselves. If we look at China, very pertinent, this week just released its new cybersecurity law. It's now the biggest e-commerce market, experiences growth in online retail sales, fintech developments, and thriving social networks. But the cybersecurity law passed this week. It imposes significant barriers of entry to foreign technology companies, such as the requirement to store data in China. And that, again, is something that we need to think carefully about in terms of advancing Australian companies' interests in the Chinese market. We need to provide more assistance to countries for beginning to modernise their legislation to encourage digital economy and resist the urge to control content. And again, I think returning to the kind of role that I will be playing, that's certainly something that I'll be addressing when I'm in Rome. We have seen US assistance to Cambodia to revise their draft cybercrime legislation. It's a great example of the kind of influence that is needed and often willingly accepted on these issues in the region. I think cybercrime is worthy of a great deal of attention, of all our attentions. The opportunities will not be harnessed unless cybercrime is addressed, and focused efforts are required, more so than we even have now. No business is going to operate in countries where it feels unsafe to do so, and that is certainly true of some countries in the region. Legal frameworks, as we look at them around the region, they're variable, prosecutions in some places non-existent, and this has created an increasingly permissive environment for cyber criminals to conduct their activities, both physically and also online. We've seen examples of crime gangs from Eastern Europe physically relocating themselves to this region. We've seen South Korean nationals carrying out attacks from Cambodia and the Philippines. We've seen Taiwanese criminals doing the same in Indonesia. It's a developing market as much as the online environment is beneficial to us all. Criminals act in the same way as a business, and they are morphing to adapt as well. Moving on to the military, what do we see with the military? It's a continuing trend. Every country that we survey has at least a nascent understanding or a contemplation of where they would like to develop militarily in this area. It's incredibly difficult to actually understand through the open source data that we access exactly what's going on, but we're getting a clearer picture. More countries are beginning to be more vocal with the kind of capabilities that they actually have and some of the doctrine around that. We've seen new military policies emerge in Indonesia and Malaysia, and they illustrate far greater detail on the views of those countries in terms of the military use of cyber. I think countries are becoming increasingly confident in their approach to integrating cyber into their concepts of modern conflict. We've seen here in Australia and also in New Zealand the revealing of offensive capability. But the most important, almost more important than the revealing of offensive capability is the fact that it was caveated with that would only ever be used within the confines of international law. Again, very important for norm setting within the region and globally to show that we and also New Zealand are responsible world actors, even though we may have great capability. We've also seen that the US has, for the first time publicly, discussed its use of an offensive cyber capability against ISIS. Again, that is a progression in terms of the level of information that's now being put out into the public. And so these developments mean that engagement on cyber norms discussions are more important than ever. And it continues in bilateral and multilateral fora. And as such, our efforts at the UN GGE, the UN Group of Government Experts, will continue to be pivotal in shaping an internet that's stable, open, and secure. The ASEAN Regional Forum, it remains a key vehicle for conflict prevention and capacity building efforts, and we've seen a continued series of meetings to try and progress the work that Australia's been working so hard to progress there as well. But further work is still needed through that forum to ensure that the pace of diplomacy keeps pace with the developments in cyberspace, which seem to be never-ending. We've seen a huge raft of bilateral work ongoing. The US and China have appeared to begun to make some headway into agreeing to some limitations on the use of cyber against one another, and have agreed that neither government would conduct or knowingly support cyber-enabled economic espionage for commercial gain. And despite some initial teething issues and for a better term, poo-pooing from parts of the community, actually it seems to be working in terms of changing some of the trends and patterns between the US and China. Computer emergency response teams seem to burden a huge amount of pressure from governments to do more together and coordinate together. But they continue to be one of the most important means for breaking down barriers between countries in the region. AP CERT, the Asia Pacific CERT, with Australia again serving as chair, tremendously serving as chair, continues its vital role in this area. But what we are seeing is that resources seem to be drying up somewhat across the region in terms of investments made in CERT teams. And it seems to be that some of the CERT teams in the region have begun to cut back on their international engagement portfolios, which is not a good development as far as we're concerned. There is a clear potential within Southeast Asian countries and also in the Pacific Islands to help build vital CERT capacity. So our goal as a nation should be to help raise the capacity of our neighbours and encourage positive policy choices wherever possible. So efforts of cyber diplomacy, regional capacity building and technological innovation remain incredibly important to the prosperity of our region. And I know and hope and look forward in future years to the ICPC's annual cyber maturity report and how it will continue to aid that process by canvassing the region's achievements and areas for development. If anything, it's shown this piece of work how important it is and needs to be built on in future years. And I certainly will need it ever more when I switch roles into government. So I would like to thank again Peter Jennings for all the investments you made in me over the past 4 years. Hopefully you feel some of that has paid off in some way. Thank you to the Minister for introducing us, and I look forward to working with you in the months ahead. And for all my future colleagues across government, it will be a pleasure serving with you and helping progress Australia's advancements. And something I'd like to lastly say is a couple of other thank yous, which are to the private sector friends who have invested financially, with their time, with their thinking, in what the ICP is about, which is the sharing of ideas, trying to help creative policy suggestions. Without your investments, without the Commonwealth Bank, without Telstra, without Tellers, none of this would be possible. So I thank them for investing in this intellectual endeavour, which I hope assists them in the work that they're doing. And finally, just like to thank my wife, who puts up with my ridiculously long hours and endless meanderings in this world. So thank you to Celine. Without her and the boys, it would be implausible that I could get all of this done. So thank you very much. Look forward to Q&A. The Minister has very kindly said that he'll take some Q&A as well. So for one of the final times, sharpen your tongues, get ready to give the Minister a grilling. And please, if you have any questions, raise your hands.